Hey, busy bees, and welcome back to another week of our prayer discussion and discussion around prayer practices. This week we are looking at praying as a community and praying as individuals. Now, this might sound a little bit familiar to those who have been part of the discussion so far when we talked about the content of our prayers. How some of the content of our prayers can be a bit larger, and then how some of the content of our prayers can be more individualized. But this class discussion this week takes a little bit of a different focus because rather than focusing on the content of our prayers, we're focusing on the people we pray with. So more of the relationship aspect and looking at with whom do we share our time of prayer. And so that can span from sharing time with a large community to just prayer by ourselves. And then there's also an intersection with that. And I think that intersection is when we pray on behalf of someone as well. So this week is less, again, about the content of the prayer and more with whom do we pray? That's the question. So when we pray as a community or pray with community around us, a large group, where does that happen? And when and why? Obviously, the people who join the group have an impact, and the circumstances under which the group is formed have an impact on the kind of prayers we offer. I think the most common for me to pray as a group with someone is on Sunday morning in a congregation. But then there's also other times at meal times with family and friends, or again with a large group. There's even times where we pray publicly. I think, growing up in South Carolina, it's not uncommon to hear prayer before the high school football game. So that community prayer has a different feel to it than congregational community prayer, maybe because of the recognition that the people who are in that crowd all come from different faith backgrounds as well. So the mix of people in the crowd have an influence on the kind of vocabulary we might use, the kind of phrases we invoke, whether we consider some of our prayer language insider language or not, and when we use that. And then there's circumstances under which we pray. And so what are the circumstances that might draw larger public crowds together? My mind goes to times of crisis. And so then we also consider what are the times of crisis that might bring people together. So these are all questions to ask and things that I'd love to hear from you as well. What are the large group communities that you often find yourself praying with? And how does the makeup of that community influence the kind of prayers that are prayed and the vocabulary that is used? And then we have this idea of praying as individuals. And when you're praying with just on your own, how does your vocabulary differ than when you're praying in a larger community? And what are some of the petitions that you lift up in your own individual prayers? Or, not to get too personal, but what is the direction that your own individual prayers might go in as opposed to a communal group? I tend to think that whenever I pray with a community, I sort of feel this need to be more structured as I go along, as opposed to individual prayer where I feel more open to trying new things just on my own, or being a little more scattered and knowing it's okay to do so. And then we have this intersection, this idea that I really wanted to get into, where we have this idea of praying on behalf of someone. That point when someone might say to you, I'm praying for you, or would you like me to pray for you? And what kind of feelings does that invoke for you? What kind of feelings does that bring up? I think for me, a lot of that depends on the community or the person that has shared that prayer with me, or shared that notion with me. Sometimes it's been very powerful. I remember right before the congregation that I currently serve was getting ready to vote on whether to call me or not to serve there. They the prayer group spent a day in prayer. And not only did they do that, but they let me know that. So it wasn't just someone's praying for you, and that would have been meaningful if they just prayed for me, but they took the time to let me know that. So I think there's something to making others in the community aware that you've prayed for them. It's one thing to maybe pray for the first responders in our community, and pray for their welfare and their safety, but it's another thing to let them know that you have lifted that up and made them aware that those prayers have been prayed for them as well. I also think that an element to this that we add in is that there are some ins and outs when it comes to praying for other people. There's some things that we want to be mindful of, and there's things that we want to be careful of. And so I think the two that I really think come to mind the quickest are the notion of confidentiality, or the concept of confidentiality, and the concept of comfort level, especially when it comes to things like, say, touch and that sort of thing. So first of all, with confidentiality, if you develop a relationship in which someone becomes comfortable with you praying for them, that is a gift, and that is a great deal of trust. And if you find that you trust someone enough to have them pray for you, that's a huge gift. But one thing to keep in mind is just because someone has shared that prayer concern with you doesn't mean they have that level of trust to share that prayer concern with a wider community. And the last thing we want to do in the midst of that trusting relationship is destroy the trust. And so it's always important to be sure and not assume that someone wants that prayer request known to others. And so my rule of thumb is always err on the side of caution. Unless you have asked someone, may I share this request with whatever group or whatever person, don't assume they want that prayer request shared. Don't assume that they want that information out there. It's always good to ask, and I really haven't encountered someone who has disliked my asking. Maybe they don't want it shared widely, but I've never encountered someone who didn't appreciate the asking. Even if the notion of sharing seemed obviously okay, I've never encountered someone who didn't appreciate me asking, may I share this with other people? And so being able to ask that question and be diligent in asking that question and keeping that level of trust, I think only makes a relationship stronger. So it's always a gift to be able to let someone know you also respect the flow of information and letting them have control over the flow of information when it comes to caring relationships in which we might pray with one another. And then when it comes to praying for someone, I also want to lift up the notion of the level of comfort that someone has. Sometimes in praying relationships, someone might want to there's a tradition of laying on of hands, or holding hands, or some kind of level of touch. And even the Bible does speak to the notion of speak to the power of laying on of hands. But I would also offer a caveat of being mindful of someone's comfort level, because not everyone is used to, say, if you were offering prayer laying on of hands, not everyone's used to that or comfortable with that, or not everyone has been made aware or familiar with that concept or educated in that concept. And so even if it's something that you might be familiar with and comfortable doing, it may not be something that another person is comfortable in receiving. And then you have a situation where the discomfort overshadows receiving the well wishes and the gift of prayer. And so we don't want to undo or we don't want to draw focus on discomfort. We would rather draw focus onto the gift of prayer and the prayer that is actually being offered up. And so again, a way to mind that is to ask, would you like to hold hands? Would you mind if I? And if someone says no, it's like, okay, that's all right. We don't have to. So those are things to keep in mind when praying on behalf of people. And I don't want to offer those to be, rules that make us cautious when it comes to praying for others while we're with them. But I offer them as hopefully tools to keep in mind and raise awareness as well as we pray for others, because when we pray for others and pray with others, that it's not just us that shows up, and it's not just our well wishes that show up, but it's also a place where God's presence shows up, and ultimately we want focus to be given to that, and so and focus to be drawn onto that. And so hopefully this has offered a bit of food for thought and some seeds for discussion, and would certainly like to know your insights as well when it comes to experiences that you've had in praying in a large community, your experiences of praying individually, and then your experiences if you've had that gift of relationship where you've been able to pray on behalf of someone, obviously not sharing too much detail to break confidentiality, or sharing of a time where someone has prayed for you and that's been a powerful experience. So certainly feel free to share, and we'd love to hear from you, and keep an ear out for the upcoming posts on the Hive. And then this will be a lead into next week as we think about ways that we can make those prayers tangible moments, where we can make the prayers that we offer something of a visual as well, that is a testament to the wider community of the prayers we lift up. So next week will be a practicum, and you'll be hearing more about that as well. But thanks for tuning in, and take care this week.